Arch Linux 4.0. The phrase itself sparks curiosity, speculation, and a bit of confusion, especially for those who are new to the Linux ecosystem or even for seasoned users who have followed Arch for years. The question is Arch Linux 4.0 real? Might sound simple, but answering it properly requires diving into how Arch Linux actually works, what versioning means in the context of Linux distributions, and why the idea of a 4.0 release doesn't really fit into Arch's philosophy. So imagine you're watching this unfold in a video where we slowly peel back the layers of what Arch Linux is, how it evolves, and why the concept of Arch Linux 4.0 is more myth than reality. Let's start from the basics. Arch Linux is a lightweight, flexible Linux distribution that follows a rolling release model. That single phrase, rolling release, is the key to understanding everything that follows. Unlike traditional operating systems that release major versions like 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, and so on, Arch Linux does not follow that pattern. There is no Arch Linux 1.0, 2.0, or 3.0 in the way people might expect. Instead, Arch is continuously updated. Once you install it, you keep updating it, and it keeps evolving. There's no need to reinstall a new version because the system is always moving forward. Now, when someone asks about Arch Linux 4.0, they are usually thinking in terms of how other operating systems behave. For example, many Linux distributions like Ubuntu or Fedora release distinct versions every few months or years. These versions come with new features, updated kernels, and sometimes major changes to the system. So it's natural for someone to assume Arch Linux might eventually reach a version called 4.0, but that assumption doesn't align with how Arch is designed. To really understand why Arch Linux 4.0 doesn't exist, we need to explore the philosophy behind Arch itself. Arch Linux is built on simplicity, minimalism, and user control. It gives users a base system and lets them build everything else according to their needs. This approach is very different from distributions that come with a lot of pre-installed software and predefined configurations. Arch is more like a blank canvas, and the user is the artist. Because of this philosophy, the developers of Arch Linux decided long ago that version numbers are unnecessary. Instead of labeling releases with version numbers, they provide installation snapshots. These snapshots are basically ISO files that you can download to install Arch Linux. Each snapshot includes the latest packages available at the time it was created. So if you download an Arch ISO today, it will contain much newer software than an ISO from a year ago. However, these snapshots are not versions in the traditional sense. They are just installation starting points. This is where some of the confusion comes in. People might see a date-based ISO file and think it represents a version. For example, an ISO might be named something like Arch Linux 1st of March 2026. That looks like a version, but it's really just a timestamp. It tells you when that snapshot was created, not that it's a new release like 4.0. Now, let's address the idea of Arch Linux 4.0 more directly. If you search online, you might come across discussions, forum posts, or even videos mentioning Arch Linux 4.0 in most cases. These are misunderstandings, jokes, or hypothetical discussions. There has never been an official announcement from the Arch Linux developers about a version called 4.0. In fact, introducing such a version would go against the core principles of Arch. Think about it this way. If Arch Linux were to release a version called 4.0, what would that even mean? Would it include a specific set of packages frozen at a certain point in time? Would users need to reinstall their systems to upgrade to it? These ideas contradict the rolling release model. In Arch, you simply run an update command, and your system becomes the latest version. There is no need to wait for a major release. Another important aspect to consider is the Linux kernel. Some people might confuse kernel versions with distribution versions. The Linux kernel does have version numbers, like 5.x, 6.x, and so on. So someone might think that when the kernel reaches a certain version, Arch Linux might also jump to a new version like 4.0. But this is not how it works. Arch Linux includes the latest stable kernel as part of its updates, but the distribution itself doesn't adopt a version number based on the kernel. Let's take a moment to imagine a scenario where someone claims Arch Linux 4.0 has been released. What would likely happen? First, experienced users would quickly question the claim because they understand how Arch works. They would look for official announcements on the Arch Linux website or mailing lists. When they find none, they would conclude that the claim is false or misleading. Meanwhile, new users might be confused and start searching for download links or release notes, only to realize that nothing official exists. This brings us to an important point about information on the internet. Not everything you see is accurate. Sometimes, content creators use catchy titles or speculative ideas to attract attention. Arch Linux 4.0 might sound exciting, like a major breakthrough or a revolutionary update. But in reality, it's just a misunderstanding of how Arch Linux operates. Now, let's shift the perspective slightly. Even though Arch Linux doesn't have versions like 4.0, it does evolve in significant ways over time. The packages get updated, new features are added, and old components are replaced. For example, changes in the init system, package manager improvements, or shifts in default configurations can have a big impact on the user experience. These changes happen gradually rather than being bundled into a single major release. So in a sense, Arch Linux is always becoming a new version of itself, but without ever assigning a number to it. The system you install today will be very different from the one you installed 5 years ago. Even if you never reinstalled it, that's the power of the rolling release model. Another interesting angle to consider is how Arch Linux compares to its derivatives. Distributions like Manjaro or EndeavorOS are based on Arch but often use version numbers for their own releases. This can add to the confusion. A user might see Manjaro 22 or something similar and assume Arch Linux must also have numbered versions. But these derivatives add their own layer of structure and release cycles on top of Arch's rolling base. Let's also talk about the community aspect. Arch Linux has a very active and knowledgeable community. The Arch Wiki is one of the most comprehensive resources in the Linux world. If Arch Linux 4.0 were real, it would be documented there in detail. The absence of any such documentation is another clear sign that it doesn't exist. Now, imagine you're explaining this in a video. You might say something like this. The idea of Arch Linux 4.0 is like asking when a river will reach version 4.0. A river is constantly flowing and changing, but it doesn't have versions. Arch Linux is similar. It's always moving forward, always updating, but never stopping to label itself with a version number. This analogy helps make the concept more intuitive. It shifts the mindset from thinking about software as a series of static releases to seeing it as a continuous process. That's a fundamental difference between rolling release distributions and fixed release distributions. Let's go a bit deeper into why this model is beneficial. One advantage is that users always have access to the latest software. There's no need to wait for a new release to get updates. This is especially important for developers, power users, and anyone who wants cutting-edge features. However, it also means that users need to be more proactive about maintaining their systems. Updates can sometimes introduce changes that require manual intervention. In contrast, fixed release distributions prioritize stability and predictability. They release new versions at set intervals and provide updates mainly for security and bug fixes. This approach is often preferred in enterprise environments where stability is critical, but for users who want the latest features, it can feel restrictive. Arch Linux takes the opposite approach. It prioritizes simplicity, transparency, and user control. The rolling release model is a natural extension of these principles. By eliminating version numbers, Arch avoids the complexity of managing multiple releases and allows users to stay on a single, continuously updated system. So when someone asks, is Arch Linux 4.0 real? The answer is straightforward. No, it's not real in the way they might think. But the deeper answer is more interesting. It's an opportunity to understand how Arch Linux works and why it doesn't need version numbers at all. As we wrap this up, it's worth reflecting on how expectations shape our understanding of technology. If you come from a background of using operating systems with clear version numbers, it's natural to look for the same pattern in Arch Linux. But once you understand the rolling release model, you realize that version numbers are not just unnecessary, they would actually be counterproductive. In the end, Arch Linux is not about reaching version 4.0 or any other number. It's about providing a simple, flexible, and continuously evolving system that puts the user in control. And that's what makes it unique. So the next time you hear someone mention Arch Linux 4.0, you'll know exactly what's going on. It's not a hidden release or a secret update. It's just a misunderstanding of a distribution that doesn't play by the usual rules. And once you understand those rules, the whole idea of version numbers starts to feel a little outdated. And that's the real takeaway here. Arch Linux doesn't need a 4.0 because it's already everything it needs to be constantly updated, always evolving and entirely in your hands.